Welcome to Better Said Than Written, the podcast that shares inspirational excerpts from books, essays, poems, and quotes that when read aloud just sound better said than written. I'm your host, Tamika Cody. In the last episode, I introduced you to the series Stories of Survival, S.O.S, where I share stories from or about people who overcame difficult challenges in their lives. The goal of S.O.S is to help others who may be going through struggles of their own. Some people are looking for a blueprint to help them navigate through life. I find that the best advice about life comes from memoirs, documentaries, and sometimes people who built up the courage to share their stories of survival on social media. A prime example, Risa Tisa with her TikTok series, Who the Fuck Did I Marry? In 50 episodes, totaling to 6 hours, Risa shared a dramatic monologue about her marriage that she says was built on an intricate web of lies. How did Risa escape? She created a plan where she brought all the receipts, and then she kicked his lying ass to the curb. This next SOS is an anonymous entry. Melanie shares her story of the time when she too was forced to create a plan. For her and her daughter's sake, Melanie needed to figure out a way to leave an abusive relationship. An abusive relationship by the hands of an intimate partner who was also the biological father of her child. Throughout this piece, Melanie admits she ignored all of the red flags. I was an awkward, sheltered, mixed-race teenage girl in a single-parent home. My mother is Latino. We mostly lived in the white neighborhoods, so I stayed secluded in the little bubble of our home and church until I was old enough to work. This is when I began to explore and experiment the world. It was mid-sophomore year. I met this guy, who I will call Charles. Charles was 10 years my senior. Red flag number 1. Charles was tall with golden brown skin, charismatic, and so much fun. His dream? To make it big in the music industry. Charles had the skills to succeed, but the weight of unhealed trauma held him back from achieving his dreams. It's a trap many young Black men struggle with. Needless to say, I was still mesmerized by him. Charles was a very popular guy. Everywhere we went, people knew his name. They hugged him and praised him, and this influenced my perception of him early on. When I was with him, I experienced a whole different world. He introduced me to the party scene, sports, and Black American culture, which my mother steered me away from throughout my childhood. About a year and a half passed, and I successfully graduated from high school. Charles and I were still an item, and I, still a virgin. One night, I went out with Charles and came home before a curfew. I dropped off my things in the house and went back out to sit in the car with Charles. After about 30 minutes, I went back into the house and my mother asked, "Where have you been?" "Outside talking to Charles," I said. "If you think you can go against my rules, you can get out," she demanded. "But I was home before curfew," I said. My mother didn't believe me and insisted that I leave. I asked my mother if I could gather my work clothes. "You should already have them," she said. "I brought them in when I came home earlier, before a curfew." My mother looked at me, puzzled, and then stepped aside. I grabbed my bag, packed my work clothes, an extra outfit, and left my childhood home. As I walked out the door, I was able to catch Charles before he pulled off. I left with him. Charles lived with his mother in the basement, in a makeshift apartment. Red flag number 2. Since there wasn't enough space, there were nights I would sleep in the park or couch surf between friends. I eventually moved in with Charles and his mother in the drap basement. Despite the cramped space, we got along fairly well, and his mother taught me a lot about life. Several months after moving in with Charles, I lost my virginity and later became pregnant. One night, there was a knock at the door. Upon answering, there stood 2 children asking for their father, Charles. At first, I only knew Charles to have 2 children, who I became close to. Now, there are 4. That's red flag number 3. In between the first 3 children, I gave birth to Charles' 4th child. To date, Charles fathered 9 children, and possibly one more to make 10. During my pregnancy, a whole lot of things happened. Since Charles had a tendency to get into situations that put his family and anyone close to him in danger, I eventually moved from the basement apartment to another set of his family in another state. I didn't know this new group of family members, and they made me feel uncomfortable. Instead of sticking around, I made the decision to move into a women's shelter where I gave birth to my daughter. Weeks after my daughter's delivery, my mother shows up. No apology, no discussion about the past. She brought me back home where I lived for a while. However, I eventually moved back with Charles. I found a job, and Charles would make ends meet by taking on side jobs, cutting hair, or with his music. We made things work for a while, but despite both of us working, it seemed like finances were not adding up. I later found out Charles had another woman, and in the same breath, he got a different woman pregnant. When that child was born, he brought the child home and asked me to take care of another woman's child. The entire scenario was similar to the scene in the movie Fences, where Denzel Washington's character, Troy Maxson, brought home a newborn baby to his wife, Rose Maxson, played by Viola Davis. Lord, a baby. A baby Troy conceived outside of his marriage. Unlike Rose, who agreed to take care of the baby with loving, open arms, I was angry at the child at that moment. To get a grasp on life, I moved out and got my own apartment. The moment I had a firm grip on my revamped life, Charles came back, asking for another chance. My heart fell weak with love, and my conscience forced me to think about my daughter. I didn't want her to grow up without a father, like I did, so I gave in. I sublet my apartment to one of Charles's friends, and I moved back in with Charles. What was I thinking? Red flag number 4. Life was good for a moment, but he was suspicious of me entertaining other men, perhaps because of his own infidelity. Eventually, his suspicions transformed into jealousy, and then verbal aggression, which then led to physical abuse. After an incident where Charles punched me in the face with a closed fist, I moved out and moved back in with my mother. Even though I removed myself from the home, Charles would show up unexpectedly at my house or my friend's house, begging for forgiveness. At first, the unannounced appearances were subtle, but then Charles became stalkerish, and at times he would show up intoxicated. On some of those drunk visits, he would try to convince me, crying on bended knees, to move back in with him. He's sobbing, saying, "Why are you doing this to me?" Somehow, we ended up in an alley, with him on top of me, holding me down. I'm fighting to get loose. I managed to get a glimpse down the alley, where a couple drove by and looked directly at what was happening and proceeded on with their day. This incident will stay with me my whole life. It prompted me to never look away whenever I see something wrong happening. By the grace of God, I convinced him to get off. I told him I would go to church with him on Sunday morning. The thing is, I knew he would not be able to wake up on time for church the next day. Time passes, and I do not see him for a while. I called Charles to arrange to get some of my belongings stored in his attic. He agrees. He acts as if nothing happened. So I don't bring up the incident. I just want to get my daughter and my things. I showed up on a Sunday afternoon. Everything seemed cool. He even helped me carry some boxes down from the attic. He comes out to see how full the car is. My daughter's in the house watching television. He begins to plead with me again. Please don't do this. Please. Please. Don't leave. We can work this out. Well, you should have thought about working things out before you cheated, beat me, and stalked me, I said with a stern tone. I don't know where this confidence came from, but I should have stayed quiet so I could leave in peace. Because the next thing I know, he pushes the door closed, and all I remember was running down the alley. When he catches up to me, he knocks me out. I woke up to him carrying me downstairs. He laid me on the bed. He took my purse, keys, shoes, and kept our daughter upstairs with him. He left me in a room with the dog, which didn't leave my side through the entire ordeal. I laid on the bed, crying. I had to come up with a plan to get out of this. Later on that night, I went upstairs with the dog and acted as if I didn't remember what happened. I said, "My head hurts. What happened?" He said that I fell and hit my head. I played along. I told him I need to go to work in the morning. He said, "I don't think you should go. How will you explain the lump and bruising?" Now, this was an effort of him trying to convince me to call out. "Well, you said I fell, right?" He nodded his head, and it seemed that my plan was working. The next morning, while I was getting ready, he said, "The baby stays here." My head starts spinning. I know if our daughter stays, my plan to get away will not work. Nevertheless, I went to work. During my shift, my boss calls me to the office. "Melanie, that's not from a fall," he said with a concerned tone. So I gave him a short version of what really happened. He advised me to call the police and to see a doctor. He was about to take it upon himself to call the police, and I pleaded with him not to. He has my daughter. I will handle this my way so she doesn't suffer in the process. While I was at work, I get a phone call. This took me by surprise. I thought it was him, but it was my sister. "Is everything okay?" she asked when I picked up the line. My gut instinct was telling me something was off. Well, I told her I was fine, and I had an argument with Charles. I confessed that he hit me. My sister went straight into Mama Bear mode. "You need to get away from there before he kills you," she said. I tried to explain I was there only to get my belongings and leave, and just like my boss, she pressed that I should call the police and lock him up. But I knew the system, and the system doesn't work like that. He would be free quicker than I can blink an eye and get to a safe space with my daughter. Around lunchtime, I make my way to the hospital. To speed up the process, they shuttle me through as a domestic violence victim. I refused to see any counselors. I explained to them I had an escape plan and that I was not going back to him. They proceeded to explain the statistics, but I let them know this is not me. I do not accept physical abuse, and I will not allow my daughter to live this way. The medical staff asked if I would be willing to press charges. I said no. This system does not keep them there due to overpopulated jails. The nurse then asked, "Would you at least speak with the police?" I buckled and agreed. Now, when the police arrived, they asked why I didn't want to press charges. I advised them to look him up and analyze all the incidents he's been in. He was always released on bond or let go because the jails were overcrowded. And to their surprise, when the police did their research, they saw everything. "So what do you want to do?" they asked. "I would like to get my daughter, my belongings, and make my way to Chicago," I explained. "How could we help you without causing a scene and arresting him?" they asked. I was taken aback. "Are you serious? This is not a trick?" I was in disbelief. But they reassured me they will do what they can without incident. I took a moment to think, and after about 30 minutes, I decided to go through with my plan. The police escorted me to the house. I drove in my own car, and they followed. And as we got closer to the house, I told the police where they should park and advised them where to walk so Charles wouldn't be suspicious. The two police officers stood behind blind spots situated behind pillars on the porch. Needless to say, they understood the assignment. So I jumped in the car, and we pull in front of the house. I rang the doorbell. Charles looked suspiciously through the blinders and the peephole. He cracked the door and asked, "Why did you come to the front of the door?" I explained to him that I forgot my keys. So he opens the door. He turns his head to tell my daughter that I'm home. And at that very moment, the police came out from behind the pillars. They direct me to get my belongings. "Melanie can go, but she can't take our daughter," Charles said. I explained to the police escorts that Charles is not listed on the birth certificate and that she's been under my care since the day she was born. The police asked Charles if what I said is true, and he confirmed. "Well, then, the child goes with Melanie. If you want to take it to court, then you need to figure that out. By the way, she's not pressing charges, and you should be happy about that. She just wants her stuff and her child." So I packed the last of my things in the car, and I thanked the officers. 2 weeks later, I arrived in Chicago. After I got my bearings, I attended nursing school. My goal and my purpose was to help victims of domestic violence. When my heart healed, I met my husband and gave birth to another daughter. Charles continued to reach out, but he eventually gave up. Needless to say, I was traumatized from everything that had happened to me. I never turned to therapy from that situation. I just kept pushing through life. Nobody ever suggested therapy because it wasn't something that was not deemed valuable in the African American or Hispanic culture. Eventually, I started seeing a therapist, but I was unable to find one who aligned with my values. So, I'm still healing, learning, and growing after all these years. Now, as a woman in my 40s, I've done a lot of inner work on myself. I finally understand what allowed me to be in a situation like that. I'm still healing wounds from my childhood, and I'm sharing my story with my daughters so they know what not to tolerate from a person like Charles and to pay attention to the red flags. Melanie, thank you for sharing your SOS. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, in the United States, about 24 people every minute of the day are victims of rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. That's more than 12 million women and men over the course of a single year. At any stage in life, there comes a time when we just can't let the bad things go. When our gut tells us to run in the opposite direction, some of us decide to stay because we think that small, still voice is wrong. Years later, we say to ourselves, I should have listened to my instincts. Some people eventually find a way and the courage to break free, and some make the choice to remain. Why? Because they don't know how to leave, because they don't have a blueprint to help them move forward. If you or someone you know is a victim of domestic violence, help is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline will guide you in the right direction. Call 800-799-7233 or text BEGIN to 88788. If you have a story of survival to share, email your entry to storiesofsurvivalentry@gmail.com or put pen to paper and mail your entry to Stories of Survival, P.O. Box 39072, Washington, D.C. 20016-9072. All of this information will be included in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, continue to move forward on your journey. And if you're tired, it's okay to take a break, but don't stay stagnant for too long, because someone is waiting to learn from you.